Thank you very much. And I hope people settle in quietly. I'm delighted to be invited by the sponsoring groups to be here today, although I truly regret being between you and lunch. We will try to keep on time so you don't expire on the spot. While I regret the timing, I love the topic. Where we want administrative law to be, to go, in an ideal world. And I think that assumes, I don't know where Tom Merrill went, but I think that assumes that people start going back to agencies and agencies start doing what they have been doing in terms of regulating. The first panel was a bit of a downer. I'm hoping that this is going to be a little bit more upbeat. So for present purposes, suspend your negativity. Suspend your sense of reality. Assume for this panel a totally clean slate. No APA, and no need to amend the APA, which would be unlikely in the current environment anyway. Let there be no preconceptions about the administrative state. We can devise, we can create, we can craft a body of law, whatever we want, to set up, develop, promote, protect the administration of law. In other words, I want the panelists and all of you to blue sky. Let your mind run. No constraints from existing law in any respect. And I want you to not worry about what the Supreme Court would say or whether it could get through Congress. I mean, this is truly run free. Do we retain the rulemaking adjudication distinctions that have guided us to date? Do we continue or enhance or diminish judicial review? Do we tweak what we have? Minor changes or major changes and start afresh. And we have a great panel here to stimulate your thoughts. They need little or no introduction to all of you, but they're in your books, so you can find out all about them, and I won't recite their titles, etc. Listen up, and like the first panel, there are notes or little pieces of paper on every table. If you have a question, scribble it, or actually write clearly, please. I'm not good at deciphering scribble. And they will be picked up and given to me for the questions and answers. And I'm going to go right down the line here with an interruption before Jen that I have what Ganesh was going to say, which I will read, although not with the passion that he might bring to it. But I will interrupt for that purpose. Let's start with Eloise.
Thanks so much, Sally, and thanks to NYU and everybody here. It's a real pleasure to be here and delight to see so many people I know and respect in the audience, and former students, and just everybody here and watching on the live stream. So I'm Eloise Pasica from the Georgetown University Law Center, and I have been working on a book project for the last year on how agencies implement their appropriations. It's an interview-based project, and in the summer and fall of 2024, I interviewed 65 different people from across the appropriations law ecosystem in DC, OMB folks, a whole variety of folks in different components of agencies, a wide variety of agencies, appropriations committee folks in both House and Senate. And it now appears, since January 20th, that the world I was documenting has been broken. The argument of the book had been that had been about how the soft power, internal administrative law, non-judicialized way that the appropriations ecosystem works was actually pretty good at fostering both a functional and an accountable government. And that is clearly no longer the world we are working in. So as I've been thinking about how to retool that book project for the current moment, I've also been working on an essay called Appropriations Presidentialism with Matt Lawrence and Zach Price, in which we document and explain the challenges of the current moment in appropriations and what these challenges mean for administrative law and separation of powers more generally. And so in working on both of these things, how to retool my book project and thinking about this work with my co-authors, I have been thinking about 5 features of the appropriations law ecosystem that, building on a clean slate, I would like administrative law to better account for. So first, let's have a thick account of the tools of administrative action beyond rulemaking and adjudication. So, for example, it has become abundantly clear since January 20th that federal grants are a critical component of how the government does its work. Close to 20% of the federal budget in an ordinary year goes to grants to state and local governments alone. In the last fiscal year, federal funding from the state and local perspective side provided more than 35% of their budgets. From the university sector to foreign aid and millions of points in between, the executive branch holds a lot of leverage through these grants. And the same is true, of course, of contracts. The same is true from an internal government perspective of just the basics of how we create and allow to function federal employee positions, federal offices, federal services. So let's account for these other tools of administrative action beyond rulemaking and adjudication. Okay, so my second thing is let's do more to account for implementation as a primary task of government. So I wrote a paper a few years ago called Executive Branch Control of Federal Grants, Policy, Pork, and Punishment. And the paper did a deep dive into the first Trump administration's use of federal grants to leverage its substantive and political goals. And as part of my decade-long effort to try to better incorporate federal grants into the administrative law regime, I explained policymaking through grants as a form of rulemaking, pork as a questionable version of the ordinary process of grant awards, a form of informal adjudication, and punishment as a corrupt version of the ordinary process of enforcement, another species of administrative action. So I got a comment on that paper from a former deputy director of management in the Office of Management and Budget who pointed out that my framework, which makes federal grants fit squarely in administrative law, she said that framework left out most of what the executive branch does with federal grants, which is assist with implementation. She said, oversee, execute, monitor, support, connect, promote best practices, leverage and share among learning communities. These were all things, she said, that were the primary work of the executive branch with grants, but there's not really a place for this work in our conception of agency action. And the same, again, is true beyond grants. So think about the program administration work of, for example, Social Security field offices, the operation of national parks, federal fire service work. We should better account for the work of implementation in administrative law. Third, let's do more to account for agency personnel beyond what we often think of as the officer-employee divide, beyond the constitutionality of for-cause removal. So the work of the federal government is done by a huge array of kinds of people and kinds of jobs, and we don't have a clear place to conceptualize this in administrative law. My research into the appropriations ecosystem has taken me into chief financial officer units, into budget offices, into appropriations liaisons with Congress, and that's just sort of my little slice. When Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy wrote their Wall Street Journal op-ed outlining their initial goals for DOGE this fall, they explained that cutting positions was in keeping with their goal to cut regulations, because regulations that were no longer needed would not need anyone to oversee and enforce them, and because fewer regulators would be needed once regulations were right-sized. Of course, though, the positions that DOGE has been eliminating extend far beyond the regulatory universe. Researchers, public health program administrators, data collectors, data protectors, park rangers, and so on. So let's have a way for administrative law to account for and make visible the wide variety of people who make the federal government work. Fourth, let's better account for internal government watchdogs as a means of accountability. So administrative law is a heavily judicialized regime, but appropriations in its subcomponents is very little. In ordinary times, very little of it appears in court. Instead, CFO offices implement internal constraints, and inspectors general offices play an important role in ensuring appropriate spending and preventing and rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. And the Government Accountability Office plays a big role in appropriations oversight through its caretaking responsibilities over the appropriations framework statutes, what I've called the power of the purse statutes, and through writing formal appropriations law decisions, evaluating the legality of agency actions and implementing their spending. So let's account for these internal alternative systems of oversight systematically in administrative law. Finally, let's better account for Congress as a meaningful actor in administrative oversight. So my research highlights the ongoing role that appropriations committees play throughout the year as agencies implement their spending. And I'm also studying the ways that authorizing committees can use certain appropriations tools, like requests for these GAO appropriations law decisions, to facilitate their own oversight. When we talk about Congress and administrative law, we often focus on constitutional dimensions like the non-delegation doctrine, or what Congress can't do, like have a one-house veto. We talk about the veto gates that make new legislation difficult, and sometimes we talk about episodic control of agency action, such as rejections of individual regulations through the Congressional Review Act when the political circumstances align. But we don't talk a lot about or have a systematic account of ongoing oversight mechanisms that committees, and importantly minorities, can use to influence, affect, control what agencies do. And these mechanisms, some of them informal, some of them formal, are important to capture the real world in which agencies operate and the textured function of checks and balances. So let's bring these congressional tools of oversight into administrative law as a core component. So to be clear, in saying that I would like these features to be a deeper part of administrative law, were I building on a clean slate, I am not actually speaking on a clean slate. So many of the ideas I just offered are present in the new governance literature, in the internal administrative law literature, in the implementation literature, the oversight literature, the public administration as a component of administrative law literature. And so there's much to draw on as we think about how to build. But at a moment where we're all thinking about working overtime, in fact, how to understand what is going on in our government, and to set forth basic principles for what we can and should expect of our government, these are features that seem to me to be worth accounting for. Thanks.
Very interesting. I'm now going to read from Ganesh's statement, and again, with apologies for the lack of enthusiasm. That's the wrong word. I'm just going to try it. My argument today is that it is a mistake to interpret the weakening of the administrative state as exceptional to the current administration or as a cynical, asymmetric phenomenon that characterizes Republican administrations. Rather, we are in the midst of a period of the secular decline of the American state, albeit one that has become more acute this year. As Ernest Hemingway wrote of bankruptcy in The Sun Also Rises, the decline of the American state happened in two ways, gradually and then suddenly. Disrupting decline will require not just a commitment to rebuilding state capacity, but understanding and accepting the uncomfortable truth that many of the causes of state decline have been long-standing. There's a real upper, okay. First, let me clarify some terms. By the American state, I mean the United States government's strength in 4 areas. First is the state's ability to operate according to the principles of rationality and legality. State decisions need to be based on reason and the rule of law, rather than cronyism, corruption, or the personal whims or preferences of leaders and their staff or allies. The second element is the state's ability to deliver positive life outcomes to citizens. This aspect of state power covers a range of substantive features, from critical social services like health care, retirement benefits, affordable food, clean water, and housing, to personnel and community security. A state that cannot deliver such benefits to its population is a state that will have very few supporters among the population. The third element of the American state is its ability to prevent bad behavior by private actors in society, not only violence and threats, but also exploitation, fraud, cheating, scams, and other harms between private persons. The final element is the capacity for institutional reform and evolution. The political system and those within it must have a commitment to institutional capacity and state building, while recognizing the need to improve structures and processes. By secular decline, I mean that the American state's capacity in these 4 areas is in decline, and that this decline is not a short-term aberration or the result of some cyclical phenomenon such as partisan control. It is a long-term trend that has been in the process for many years and will continue for many years going forward, absent some exceptional disruption. The secular decline of the American state is the function of a variety of factors. No single one is the sole determinant of decline, and many of the factors are interconnected. In this paper, I describe many of these factors in detail. Let me outline 10 of them briefly. First, building is harder than breaking. One can easily fire experts, eliminate positions, outsource government operation, and privatize public resources, but it's difficult, if not impossible, to rapidly recruit new hires with decades of specialized experience and expertise. The asymmetry of building and breaking renders cyclical theories of decline implausible. If one administration severely weakens state capacity, the next administration cannot just snap his fingers and undo that weakness immediately. State capacity may move 2 steps backwards and, at best, 1 step forward. The result is neither slow progress or tit-for-tat cycles, but secular decline. 2, the Red Queen effect. In evolutionary theory, the Red Queen hypothesis is that species that cohabit an ecosystem may need to evolve together, or else the species or else the species that fails to evolve will decline. The hypothesis draws on the Red Queen's observation in Alice in Wonderland that it takes all the running you can do to remain in the same place. State capacity is similar. States must grow and evolve with changes in society. But from the perspective of social and technological change, the American state has been in decline for some time because it has not kept up with the times, whether that is its use of technology for efficient operations or the regulation of new technologies and social developments. 3, neoliberal ideology and policy. For the last half century, neoliberal ideas have dominated public policy. By neoliberal, I mean a focus on deregulation, privatization, trade liberalization, and austerity. Both Republican and Democrats supported these policies from the late 1970s into the 2000s. These policies consistently involved withdrawing state capacity to deliver services and to regulate private parties, and they were not replaced with effective alternatives. 4, the denigration of bureaucratic reputation. In his study, The Forging of Bureaucratic Anatomy, Daniel Carpenter shows that the development and substance of bureaucratic reputation was critical to the development of American state capacity. Bureaucratic reputation allows agencies to have independent trust and power separate from the political whims and wins. Over the latter part of the 20th and early 21st century, leaders in both political parties have denigrated and disregarded bureaucracy. It's the B word. That's mine, interjection, sorry. I just want to see if you're all awake. Leading to decay in its reputation. Successive presidents regularly framed government and bureaucracy as an evil to be shrunk, cabined, and constrained. The centralization of presidential authority, what then Professor Elena Kagan called presidential administration, may also have contributed to the decline of bureaucratic reputation. As presidents become more intertwined with agency action, it becomes reasonable to see agency actions as politically motivated and directed rather than based on legislative direction and technical expertise. Finally, when agencies lose their reputation for accuracy and precision, their capacity to operate declines. Consider public health agencies during the COVID-19 pandemic. Poor messaging choices has meant a reduction in reputation. Restoring reputation, needless to say, is difficult work. 5, legislative gridlock. The United States Congress is unable to pass significant regulatory legislation or programmatic regulation except under exceptional circumstances. The inability to legislate is, perhaps definitionally, a problem leading to the decline in state capacity. New problems require new solutions, and the failure to address those programmatically or regulatorily or to reform institutions to address new conditions means the state fails in its mission. 6, submerged policymaking. There is a tendency among some policymakers, particularly Democrats, to hide policies and the role of the state in advancing these policies. This tendency towards what Suzanne Mettler called the submerged state may be appealing to technocrats, but it ignores political psychology. People need to know that the state provides and regulates in order to build support for the state continuing to do so. Submerging policy may be politically expedient, but it may eventually weaken state capacity by hiding the positive things the state does. 7, proceduralism. Procedures are essential to rational legal administration. But over-proceduralization can mean it takes longer for the government to act, makes it harder for such actions to take effect, and makes it easier for those actions to be challenged in court due to minor procedural violations. In many ways, as Nick Bagley has described, the U.S. government has become over-proceduralized, making delivery and regulation too difficult. 8, the collapse of countervailing powers. Historically, social and political movements and organizations in the United States, including farmers, labor, and other, pushed their state building as a way to deliver for people and regulate private oppression. These countervailing powers have collapsed. As just one example, labor union membership dropped in 2024 to an all-time low to less than 10% of U.S. workers. The collapse of these countervailing powers is important because state building needs a constituency that pushes for it. 9, political politics and ideology. In the past decade, the conservative legal movement and judges appointed by Republican presidents have increasingly adopted positions that involve limiting the power and authority of the American state. This is definitionally a contributor to declining state capacity. 10, oligarchic influence. While people have decried money in politics for decades, oligarchic influence has become especially brazen in recent years. Oligarchic influence contributes to secular decline in 3 ways. Oligarchs do not want regulations over their businesses, but the state must be able to regulate private oppression and frauds. Oligarchs also do not want higher taxes or more government spending, but spending on social programs and public goals are essential to delivering a good life. Third, oligarchs want contracts and subsidies for their own companies and not for their competitors. Oligarchic influence can thus lead to cronyism and corruption rather than legal decision-making. That's a very sharp point at this point. These 10 factors, some more recent, some quite long-standing, together suggest that the American state is in a period of secular decline, albeit one that has become more acute lately. The obvious question is this: is reversing secular decline possible? Perhaps, but it will be a challenge. Policy proposals for new institutional forms, structures, or policies may not be achievable precisely because the many factors above have created a system in which such policies cannot be adopted, or at least adopted easily. Reversing secular decline will therefore likely require a larger scale social and political disruption, one that creates the space for political and policy change that can cut through the dynamics of secular decline. Disruption on such a scale could come from crises such as economic depressions, political backlash from the failure of the state to develop or regulate, or generational changes. In each of these cases, success in arresting secular decline will require political leaders to change their approach to governing. First, political elites will need to develop plans in advance for what the institutional reforms they will undertake when the window of opportunity is open. Second, they will need to act swiftly in order to deliver reforms fast enough that people can see change taking place, and fast enough for that change to deliver for people before the next election. And third, they will likely need to decentralize authority to cabinet departments and agencies so that decisions can be made more quickly and bureaucratic reputation and autonomy can slowly be rebuilt. This will be a tall order, but it is a necessary one if we are to revitalize the American state. That's a lot to think about. And it really deserves an applause at this point. I assume that this will be published, and I invite you all to read it at your own pace and with your own emphasis, but there's a lot of stuff in here. Jen, tough act to follow.
I know. Well, maybe I'll just pick up where I think partly, he leaves off, which is, part of the topic and the discussion today, of course, is like, what do we do in the face of this secular decline to hopefully rebuild and rethink? We have an exceptional amount of expertise in the room, so I'm really eager to get to the discussion and the Q&A in addition to hearing from my co-panelists. So I'm going to be very, very brief. Part of this constructor project, I'm just going to lob out two ideas, food for thought. One is going to be more focused on doctrine and how we as administrative law scholars might kind of reshift some of our conceptual thinking. And then second is part of that project, what I'll call a turn from the false dichotomy, talking about politics and expertise, to maybe a turn to talking more about like effectiveness and outcomes. And this picks up a lot on the themes that I think, Eloise, you picked up, that you put on the table. And then finally, I'll just lob out a few thoughts in service of effectiveness and expertise in personnel reform, which I think is so critical given all of what has happened of late. Okay, so first in terms of getting rid of this false dichotomy, stop talking about, conference after conference about politics and expertise. I mean, obviously there have been many scholars that have pressed on the tensions and the difficulty of talking about those terms. I just want to point out two things about kind of the nature of arbitrariness review and like what it looks like now. By focusing just on these like technocratic features, the court just does not have resources to like account for the fact that agencies, operate in highly political environments, and therefore we have decisions like, Ohio versus EPA, which just like fly specking, focused on like processes without any sort of analysis of, look, did the policy actually try to accomplish what was called for by Congress and the political appointees. Similarly, with Chevron, Chevron, talks both about politics and expertise as a reason for deference. And, I felt, in writing papers about, Chevron, I am glad not to have a section that says, oh, is it politics and expertise when they come into conflict, when there are statutes that say reasonableness, like, well, what's the basis? When there's these tensions, what's the basis for deferring? They were unsatisfying to like try and reconcile those things. I thought those were just unhelpful characteristics. Why has this dichotomy, I think, increasingly broken down if we just, go away from doctrine? I think a lot of our pitched regulatory battles today and beyond regulation, are questions of science policy. They're in situations of great uncertainty, where politics and expertise, have to be in dialogue, at least in the pure forms have to be in dialogue, and it's not just one or the other. In terms of political accountability, I think, given technological changes and the fact that people are balkanized, right, we can have a situation like we do with Doge where, on the one hand, speaking to one audience, right, Elon Musk can say, I'm in charge, right, whereas the acting administrator can say to her private group chat, she's not in charge, and in court, there can be something different. Anyway, all of these different accounts are hitting different audiences, so political accountability just doesn't work anymore. So in terms of shifting the doctrinal focus to something more like effectiveness, I wonder if more could be made in Section 706 from turning to like arbitrariness to like abuse of discretion. Like what, can that be used to say, look, it's an abuse of discretion when, we can't focus on effectiveness. Just as Eloise said, I agree, these doctrinaire kind of conversations about removal and appointment just aren't getting to, what we really want to care about. And I think that there are resources in the doctrine that even maybe the Supreme Court could get on board with. I am thinking of just the language of the removal cases in Morrison about, look, do these restrictions unconstitutionally impede the president's, ability to carry out constitutional duties? I mean, that is in a framework of effectiveness. The last thing I'll say on this theme is, of course, in order to be effective, we need to have the right personnel, just, as was brought out. So just, lobbing out a few quick, kind of thoughts on that sort of blue sky thinking. There needs to be really radical reforms to direct hire authority, a revisiting of all the statutes. Right now, research shows it takes 106 days on average to hire a new person into government, right? Only 6% of federal employees are under 30 right now. And, the statutory requirement that, there has to be a shortage of minimally qualified candidates, that needs to be revisited, I think, with these aims toward effectiveness and flexibility. I think there could be statutory goals, something more on the order of 30 to 60 days, right, for completing hiring after posting a vacancy, and so on. I think another area of reform here is reskilling the federal government to deal with all the technological changes. It is impossible to get people in to deal with technology and AI. We have huge problems with having the government being able to rapidly address how notice and comment rulemaking is going to change with ChatGPT writing the comments, right? I mean, how is the government going to stay on top of that? Obviously, it needs to, marshal AI as well, and then we have all the questions that many folks in this room have thought about, how does that change our thinking about considering comments and so on. Lastly, I think there needs to be a lot more thinking about flexibility within personnel. I think there needs to be a lot more interagency mobility, whether this is expanding temporary detail programs, portable benefits and seniority across agencies, because I think that will reduce the pressures that exist right now to hire from the outside. And that's why we have problems like the special government employee sort of ways to get Elon Musk into government and so on. I mean, just the IPA programs, I mean, that pressure, I think, can be reduced by taking advantage of the expertise and the personnel that we have now. And looking forward, my hope is that some of these flexibilities will help rebuild the capacity for government in these challenging times.
Thank you. Sabine.
Great. Well, this has been so rich already, and just to say, add my thanks to what a treat to be share the stage with friends and colleagues, and in this room with lots of people I've had the chance to work with and learn from, and continue to learn from. So this is very, very exciting. I think my thoughts resonate with a lot of what's already been put on the table, which is great. Let me try to zoom back a little bit, or pull back and say three things. One about what the kind of state we are seeing built before us is not just a deregulatory move. I think that's right. Two, what our first principles ought to be, sort of echoing some of what's already been said. And then three, what the design sort of frontiers then look like. So on the first piece, and this is some of what I'm writing up for the symposium, I think we really need to get out of the frame of thinking of this as a deregulatory enterprise, because of course, like at the same time that we're seeing the destruction wholesale of huge governmental authorities, we are also seeing the unshackling and weaponizing, right, of authorities to, for example, rendition arbitrarily in broad daylight people who ought not to be done so in a democracy. And as administrative law, I think we have to have all of that in the frame, especially if we're thinking what the future of the state ought to be. And so I think a better way to understand what's happening and being built is what I think of as reactionary administration, in the sense that it is a dismantling of some capacities and building up, weaponizing of other capacities, serving the end, whether intentional or unintentional, of reaction, in Corey Robin's sense of the term, as the end of reasserting old hierarchies of race, class, gender, political power, right? That it's not a coincidence that ICE is going to get $45 billion and can do whatever it wants, while the NLRB has been crippled by a arguably unlawful removal of commissioner. So there is a substantive, normative substance to the kind of state that is being built before our eyes. I think that's really important as a predicate for then what are the normative foundations of a new blue sky state. And I don't mean in a more narrow kind of as a Democrat or progressive or as a part of a particular party, but at a high enough level of as a democracy, what are those normative priors? So this is now my second point. I would offer that I think we should think about the future of the state in terms of a framework of anti-domination, or classic kind of small r republicanism. And by that, what I mean is a small r republicanism at its core, to me, is about an opposition to the concentration of arbitrary power that applies as against the state, the arbitrary power of the tyrant or the monarch. It also applies as against private actors, the arbitrary power, for example, of the employer to force an employee to work without bathroom breaks until they literally die of a heart attack on the floor, as has happened in many Amazon warehouses, and the kind of more private tyrannies that is a way of understanding racial and gender discrimination, right? In the workplace, the separation of public and private. These are all different forms, to my mind, of domination, of unaccountable power. And so a republic, small r republic, is one that creates state institutions to limit that. Now, so what does that mean? I think it actually reframes in important ways, in ways that resonate with what my co-panelists have said, some of how we normally think about administrative law. First, it means that an institutional structure that we want to build should be as concerned with restraining private power as it is with restraining public power. And second, to this point about efficacy that a number of us have raised, it means the state has to be both effective at doing this and constrained in important ways, right? Now, these are tensions. It's not a blueprint, but it's a way to start thinking about how do we, like, is our balance of constraint and power right? Is our balance of focusing on our worries about public power versus our worries about private power right? And in this moment of blue sky, we can reimagine some of how we're balancing that. So where would that take us institutionally? Let me offer up a few ideas. So I think there are really three, to my mind, three kind of big design fights or design domains that different ones of us will have different sort of expertise and interest in. The first is in what I think of as the macro structure of the administrative state. So this is really about, like, if we were to think blue sky, what new authorities would we charter? What agencies would we actually draw down and dismantle? You know, after 9/11, we created DHS. And after the 2008 crisis, we created the CFPB. We can have a conversation about the merits and demerits of both of those. But I think it's kind of incumbent on some subset of us to think about, okay, in a world of the modern kinds of private power, like, is the right answer a restoration of the FTC and the CFPB, or a different enterprise altogether? In the world of the climate crisis, do we actually want EPA and energy and FEMA spread out the way they are, or is there a different structure that will enable us to deal with climate catastrophe? We can go down the line, but that's a line of inquiry I would love many of us sort of scholars and practitioners to be thinking about. And similarly then on the dismantling, right? I think we really do have to reckon with what it takes to restore the legitimacy of a state after the kind of extremely terrifying exercises of state power on communities that we are seeing in real time. So that's the first bucket, macro structure. The second design bucket, and there's only two, I only have three, so then I'll stop. The second design bucket is what I think of as, like, the internal, like, mesostructures of the executive branch. And this is where I would put many of our familiar debates about, you know, presidential administration, cost-benefit analysis, et cetera. But here, I think, too, we can start to think much more blue sky and creatively. I love Eloise's list of, you know, the things that need to be brought in scope, and I totally endorse all of that and a lot of what Jen said as well. I think here are some of the places where my mind goes are things like, okay, you know, we want expertise. We also do want some forms of participation and accountability, but how to cash that out in a way that actually allows us to move fast and at scale. So can we think about different ways of executing those objectives? You know, participation in upstream at the level of sectoral planning or before a big set of enterprise decisions are made feels very different to me than, like, after the fact, you know, kind of participation and sort of kind of citizen supervisions and so forth. Like, there are ways we could imagine this differently. Similarly, I'm really interested in how could we imagine the internal executive branch process that deals with bundles of regulatory actions, right? So it's not, you know, we can talk about rulemaking, but, you know, from a climate standpoint, for example, it's actually the bundle of Clean Air Act rules with enforcement actions, with grant programs that was the meat of a lot of the climate policy of the last few years, and we don't actually have, like, that fits in the executive order frame, but it doesn't fit in, like, how we divvy up 12866 review and budgetary review by OMB and so forth, right? So we could actually bucket things very differently. And then the last thing I'll mention in this category is I do think we have to reckon really deeply with what DOGE represents, not just in terms of what the havoc is wreaking on the civil service and so forth. But in some ways, what Doge illustrates is actually the whole notion of agencies supervised by a White House is kind of not actually how power flows in the executive branch. If you're able to hijack control of the database, the HR systems, and the money, you control the entire executive branch, regardless of what the agency has to say about it. Now, that's, of course, all of it is unlawful and immoral on different levels. So I'm not saying we should replicate it, but I actually think it raises really tough questions that I'm not sure I have the answer to yet about what does even presidential coordination look like when it's not agencies huddle with policy council to come to a result. It is, I control whether you have access to the building, and I can flip it off with the press of a button, and that's how I control, supervise the agencies. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, because I know we've got a lot on the table already, is this kind of third set of design questions, which I think of as the broader, the external enabling or disabling environment from the perspective of the agency. And Congress has already come up a lot. I'm so glad Chris is here because I'm eager his thoughts on this too. But I really do think a big outcome from this, left, right, or center, ought to be a greater consensus around Article 1 and Article 1's primacy. Right, whatever you think about the scope of executive power, a lot of the tensions, I think, about that we fight over with regards to executive power go away if you actually have an honest-to-God, responsive, dynamic, and representative Congress, which we do not on either front, right? So some of that is a democracy reform conversation, but some of that is also INS v. Chadha is low-key a big contributor to our crisis of the administrative state. And other people have said this, not just me. And so there's the role of Congress. And then to Ganesh and Absenja's point about the balance of power is, I think, this in civil society is a huge part of this, right? Which is not an administrative law problem per se, but absent robust social movement organizing that exists outside of the electoral partisan context. You just don't have the kind of political constituency to make any of these laws meaningful and sticky in any durable kinds of way. So these are, I think, three sets of design questions where I would love to see us who are thinking in a blue sky way dig in more and play around with some of the ideas already generated. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. Before I call on Chris, I was told I must state and spell the CLE code. It's Chevron.
Oh, no.
If anyone doesn't know how to spell Chevron, well, it's CHEVRON, and I have to repeat it, Chevron. Thank you. Chris.
All right, well, this is super fun. The paper that I'm doing for the symposium with my amazing co-author, Andrew Hammond, actually builds on Kristen's last comment on the last panel, which is we look at all the cases after Kaiser, and we argue that the Supreme Court really has to focus when it thinks about stare decisis on administrability. Not whether the prior doctrine is administrable, but what they're actually replacing it with is, and we kind of walk through that. So that'll be out in the NYU Law Review at some point. But on this panel, I want to kind of take up this challenge, and I think I'm going to provide a pretty different view than Ganesh or than Sybil did. And I want to talk about separation of powers and re-envisioning separation of powers. And I see kind of two main intention values there. The first is what I think Jillian Metzger puts best, that separation of powers includes effective governance. When Congress passes a statute with the president's approval, that statute has to be effective. We cannot have a separation of powers framework where Congress's laws do not go into effect. And on the flip side, liberty is a central part of separation of powers. And I'm not going to go full Gorsuch, or as academics call it, full hamburger on liberty. But I am going to kind of talk about it more in the sense of stability and predictability and creating space for individuals and associations and businesses to flourish, to innovate, and to continue to build. I think that's a central part of separation of powers. And so I'm going to focus on the three branches of the federal government in my kind of 5 minutes and not talk about states or individuals or interest groups, including political parties, because there's too much to talk about. But if I'm thinking about separation of powers or re-envisioning them, like writing on a clean slate, I view Congress as the body that makes the major value judgments at the federal level. Congress has to be regularly reauthorizing and revisiting those value judgments, especially when it comes to commanding how the executive branch implements policy. And Congress also has to continue to use, develop, and strengthen its regular influence over policy through appropriations and oversight. So that's kind of how I view the role of Congress. When it comes to the courts, I think I'd almost fully embrace Jeff Pojanowski's neoclassical administrative law. And what he would say is that courts should be exercising independent judgment over legal questions. So when it comes to what the law means, Loper-Bright, and I'm saying this having defended Chevron for a very long time, but we're writing on a clean slate, that Loper-Bright should be the law of the land, that courts should say what the law is. On the flip side, though, when Congress has charged the executive branch to implement a law, there should be a very light touch on policy. Courts should not be patrolling policy other than the procedural mechanisms that Congress has said that the agency has to follow. And the last part on that is the role of courts under that framework is about statutory interpretation, including the major questions doctrine, and they should lower the temperature on constitutional challenges. Non-delegation doctrine, all these other types of assaults on the administrative state, on the bargain that the executive branch and Congress had, really shouldn't be part of that. Now, this is not new. This is Jeff Pojanowski's view, and maybe he'll text me later and say I didn't get it right. And if I didn't, then it's my view. The last part is, what about the executive branch? Well, presidential administration, as Justice Kagan has put forth, should be the vision of the executive branch. I'd go further and say that agency heads should be removable at will, because the executive branch should be controlled by a president of the United States. And the agency head should have final decision-making authority over any decision within that agency, to the extent the agency head wants to have final decision-making authority. On the flip side, though, we have to have a professionalized civil service. We have to create a bureaucracy that's hired and fired based on merit, and is able to make decisions, or at least find facts, create a record, help create kind of the basis on which a policy decision is made without the fear of being fired or otherwise punished. And if you kind of put those kind of things together, at least when I think about separation of powers, if I were writing on a clean slate, that's what each branch of the federal government would do. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chris. Remember to write your questions on the cards, which will be brought to me, and I will decipher them. I have one question that I would like to pose to our panelists. And some of you have talked structure and how you would reorganize something. Some of you have talked implementation. I'd like you to address first principles, which is values. What do you see as the values that should be embodied, embraced, and endorsed in whatever the new ad law would be? You can have 1, 3, 4, whatever. So Eloise, I'm going to start with you.
I'm going to go with effective government. So I think there is a lot of overlap with what people have been saying. What is the point of any of this if we are not producing a government that works? So effective government, but I also would say fairness, which I take to be distinct from liberty. So I would say fairness, because we want to have people feel that the government is working for them, that their concerns have been heard, and that there is some component of kind of like both distribution, but also liberty requires, in my view of this fairness component, provision of government services. And so that's where I would come out, effective government and fairness, which also I think addresses some of the like the part of, what Sabine was just saying about the parts of our government that are being built up right now, the sort of the rendering of folks from, in sort of shocking ways. So effectiveness, effective government, and fairness.
Okay, Jen?
Yeah, as my remarks already suggested, fully agree that effectiveness should be an important part of the discussion of a master principle. Maybe the only thing I will add to that is playing around with some idea of transparent, like revealed effectiveness. Because I think people need to know, that the government is effective. And so I think that can translate into a bunch of, doctrines that we could go into and reforms that make that, clear to the public.
Sabine?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's this notion of anti-domination, like I talked about, and maybe we can have a longer conversation offline about like what are the tensions or overlaps with fairness, with the liberty, as you described it, Chris. I mean, I think for me, the bottom line of it, there's an end, a certain kind of human freedom and flourishing as a society that we seek to create, right, as the preamble of our Constitution. And then we have a set of second order principles about how government ought to do those things, which I would think of as our good governance principles: transparency, accountability, predictability, right? But it's nested, right? That like ultimately we have to create a flourishing, inclusive, egalitarian society in which we can all pursue the life projects that we might want. But there are some second order principles about how government should do that and how it should.
Yeah, it's interesting on the fairness, I don't agree. I think that's a major value judgment that Congress will build into certain regulatory areas, and that instead separation of powers really is about, it's a pro-market government limiting approach that requires Congress to intervene into a market, but make a major value judgment to regulate it. But the default really is no regulation, and I think that's really important. And so the idea of fairness, well, if Congress wants to define fairness in a certain area, which I think to mean something different than like notice and opportunity to be heard, but more like, are things distributed correctly within a particular industry? Are planes run by the government or by private parties? Those are major value judgments Congress should make, but the default really should be liberty and not regulation, not a regulated industry. So in that sense, I think it's a very stark and hopefully very different view than some of the LP movement has been putting out.
Quickly, just on that, I don't actually disagree with the notion that Congress should make the value judgment. I think it has made the value judgment in a number of the statutes that the executive branch is trying to implement, including on things like anti-monopoly and civil rights and so forth. But there are things to work out there, which I think is.
I was also going to clarify to make the same point that I am not sort of saying that the executive branch should implement freestanding fairness principles necessarily. I also take this to be part of a non-arbitrariness distribution.
that's fair.
And so, Congress has got to do a lot more work in my judgment, but I do think there is a real difference here, and so I'm going to acknowledge that. But I also think that there is kind of more overlap at the edges than sort of maybe initially.
Can I just tie this conversation back to the previous panel too, about Loper-Bright and statutory interpretation? I think these visions, there are some tensions, but I see overlap too, require more thinking about what does this mean for statutory interpretation? We can't just be textualism versus purposivism. I think there are ways to better reconcile it, to be okay, what did Congress want to achieve as evidenced by both the text and not a freestanding notion of purpose?
Yeah, and I think Kristen's point about footnotes 5 and 6 in the accompanying text of Loper-Bright, that's where a lot of the work's going to be done, is the best interpretation that Congress did delegate to the agency? And if so, then I think we're in a very light touch land of review of policymaking.
I am surprised at the limited designation of values. I would have thought Sabine would have jumped in on public participation as something that was critical, that somebody would have mentioned expertise, which has long been the rationale for delegation to an agency. Someone spoke of flexibility in their opening comments, but I didn't hear that, or the twin part of that, which is the ability to grow over time. I'm not going with the living constitution theory as much as a recognition that the world changes, and we're not in the 1930s anymore for a variety of reasons. And the last one is I didn't hear anything about guardrails. And at a time like this, when we're seeing the diminishment or demise of guardrails, one would have thought that that would be an important value. So you all were limiting yourselves to 1 or 2. Try 3 or 4. See if you can embrace more.
I think this is a level of generality game, because when I talk about effective government, I would say that many of the first few items that you put on the list are probably subcomponents. So I think that's kind of what
Yeah, I
Sabeel
agree.
was getting at when he was sort of like, here's all the things that I think are a part of, anti-domination. And I would say that fairness subsumes conceptions of guardrails. So I like, your list sounds good to me, and I think they are part of my 2 values.
Sally, I would add another one when it comes to judicial review of, and I'm going to be writing a lot more about this, of proportionality review. In other words, like, we really need to envision an administrative state that if it's a really run-of-the-mill implementation thing, there really should be no judicial review. Like, it should be, but the more important the question gets, the more the court searches. And I think the court's been trying to do that in a haphazard way. But that would also be part of it, is like the interaction between the judicial branch and the political branches should be one of proportionality.
Another question that has come from the audience is, if Congress is to play a more central role, as some of you have suggested, one part of this is, how do we fix Congress to do that? And the second part is, what's the right balance between Congress and the agencies that would carry forward in the determination of policy? And I'm going to start with Chris on this one.
Yeah, I mean, so we had a whole Federal Society National Student Symposium in March at the University of Michigan where we tried to tackle this. And I think part of it, I'll echo Sabeel. I mean, Congress, it's broken, both in terms of representation, election, ambition, and I don't have the skill or expertise to tell you how to fix that. But I do have to say that every chance we have a chance to bring smart people in a room together, especially you all students out there, we need to demand, encourage, inspire you all to think about how to make Congress work again, and hold conferences talking about it. I have a lot of little tricks and gimmicks I can give you about how to make it easier for Congress to legislate, to respond to major questions, doctrine decisions, to reauthorize statutes. But those are kind of gimmicks and tricks, but you got to get Congress back at the table doing its job. And I think the only way you can do that is by us demanding that of the people that we vote for to be in Congress.
Any other panelists comment?
So I would just say that I think it's part of our job as administrative law professors, and so therefore sort of part of students' job in sitting in classes with us. I think we ought to do more work on Congress in administrative law. So I was thinking the other day, we teach all these justiciability doctrines, and yet we sort of expect students to go on to take federal court still. We teach statutory interpretation, but we expect students still to go on to take legislation. I was just sort of conferring with Anita, who teaches legislation yesterday, Professor Krishna Kumar, and I was asking, well, how much about oversight do you teach in legislation? And she said almost, very little. And so maybe that actually is our job, that instead of just teaching all the doctrines, judicial review doctrines, when we think about how to constrain agency action, we should be doing more. And again, not in this episodic Congressional Review Act kind of way, but really just like, what are the granular tools? And so I would like to see more of that.
Yeah, just quickly on that, I love both of those interventions. I think 2 things I would add is, one, insofar as we're thinking blue sky, like, I know other folks are working on this, but we need to think about how do we make Congress genuinely proportionally representative, which it's not, and some of that is a constitutional problem, some of that is a statutory problem. But maybe a question for the admin law space, or picking up what you're suggesting, Eloise. It'd be really interesting to me to think about how many of our intramural administrative law fights dissipate, and to what degree do they dissipate if we have a functional Congress in the ways that we would all want. I don't think it would resolve all of the tensions, because nothing can or should, but I think it would actually be useful as an exercise, right? That how much of our fights or disagreements about the appropriate role of executive discretion, blah, 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 is actually downstream of a presumed failure of Congress to be sort of as responsive as we might want it to be.
Well, let's bring it back to separation of powers for Chris, and that is the court is telling the Congress how it can legislate or how it can not legislate by telling them that you have to be specific about something or anticipate something. Has the court crossed the line in separation of powers to bullying the Congress? And if you start with Congress, how do you defend against that kind of an allegation?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One, I think in a lot of ways, these doctrinal moves, major questions, doctrine, non-delegation, liberal right, are actually about constraining the president and not Congress. On the Congress front, you know, it's hard because, like, in my ideal clean slate, like, it includes all the stuff the court's done on the statutory interpretation side. And yet, in the world we live in, what they've done is hugely disruptive. I mean, Congress has legislated against the backdrop of Chevron for at least 40 years, arguably since at least the APA, because I view that, you know, and similarly, the major questions doctrine, while I think it is a wonderful innovation that Congress should codify and embrace as one of its rules of the road, I mean, that's not something against which Congress was legislating in the 60s and 70s when they created the new administrative state of health, welfare, and safety. So I don't disagree with you there. I think the court is introducing a lot of kind of unfair, you know, rearranging the deck chairs, not even the deck chairs, the actual, you know, building in ways that are going to really undercut what Congress is trying to do over the decades.
I'll just say, I'm personally not concerned too much about like the separation of powers aspect to this this observation, because, you know, I think to me, this is like the court saying, this is how we, you know, as courts will interpret these statutes. It's not like a command, you know, it's more like an incentive creation for like Congress, if you want to do this, this is how you should do it. But to tie back to the previous question, I just want to say, you know, before we like celebrate Congress and, you know, I want to be more assured and more have thinking and writing and sustained sort of suggestions for increasing the capacity and knowledge within Congress. I think that is sorely lacking, probably because a lot of these dynamic effects. But, you know, like there are a lot of really interesting ideas that we could think about, right? Like more, for example, detailing between, you know, the executive branch and Congress. There's some research on that. I think more thinking about, you know, what Abby Gluck and Jesse Cross have called the congressional bureaucracy is very important. It's not subject matter specific. The committees themselves, given how they're you know, the jurisdictional practices, as I understand it, it doesn't have the same kind of coordination of expertise that the executive branch does. So I hope that that remains an important part of the conversation.
And
Would you want to
including pay, right? I mean, they should be paid the same
Yeah,
amount
right.
as anyone that works in the executive branch in a similar position.
All right, from the very blue sky general comments, we will end with a specific question. The Trump administration has seemingly gone to war against notice and comment. For those who don't know it, there was an executive order a couple of days ago about shower pressure, and the president stated in the executive order that it did not require any notice or comment because he was telling the Department of Energy what to do. So there. Is this an opportunity for consensus? Anybody?
I mean, I think we're at email 106 on the administrative law professor listserv about the showers.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I think we're at email 106 on the administrative law professor listserv on the showers. But, you know, there are interesting theoretical questions about if a regulation is unconstitutional or unlawful, like whether, but no, I mean, you've got to go through notice of comment. Sorry,
All those for notice and comment, raise your hands.
even for shower pressure, which having last night no, I would have liked to shower that, but still, you got to do notice of comment.
I think that's true, but just one thing, it's a good example, though, of something that's, I think, coming on all of us as, like, lawyers navigating this moment. Like, so Aziz Haq had this great piece a few weeks ago about a dual system of government that, in the Atlantic, I recommended, in part because there's, like, a traditional like good faith law conversation to have about notice and comment and the president's role and da-da-da, and like there I would say like, yeah, like notice and comment is a law of the land, you can't just blow past it. But there's like another, but that's kind of a shell game too, right? Because what the president is trying to do is trying to invoke, in my view, trying to invoke the appearance of just enough legality to exercise what anyone, once you zoom out, would say it's clearly an autocratic power grab, regardless of whether you think notice and comment is a good idea. I might actually want to revise the notice and comment in the APA, but it's like unequivocal that the showerhead EO is like massively like violates all of our core principles as a democracy, in my view.
Jen or Eloise, last comments?
Hopefully I'm not the last. I'll just maybe just say one thing to tie together some things that have come out. I do think what the showerheads EO and the sunset EO, that's part of this larger conversation about like proportionality, because the sunset EO, right, it's like very striking that it's like notice and comment for these sunset provisions, but we're going to do it through a request for information. So it's kind of like, a notice and comment APA light, right? And it's trying to, just, again, it's this theme about like flexibility and process and proportionality.
Absolutely.
I'll just say, I'm going to kind of underscore what Sabine just said about there's like good faith tinkering to improve things and clear-headed understanding about what is truly going on. And I think it is important to have both of those things in my mind, in your mind, in our minds at this moment.
Thank you all, and can I hear the audience appreciation for the panel?
Great.